This program explores the history of Palestine since the late 18th century. Part 1 is titled The Threads of the Conspiracy, focusing on where and how the events began. The series was produced by Rawan al-Damin, who introduces it in her own words.
1948. For Palestinians, that year is النكبة, or the catastrophe, when hundreds of thousands were forced out of their homes. For Israelis, that year marks the creation of the State of Israel. As a filmmaker and as a Palestinian, this documentary series was my way to understand the events of the past that are still shaping the present.
We begin with a quote from the British historian Arnold Toynbee.
The tragedy in Palestine is not just a local one. It is a tragedy for the world because it's an injustice that is a menace to the world's peace.
Our story starts here in 1799, outside the walls of Acre in Ottoman-controlled Palestine. An army under Napoleon Bonaparte besieged the city, all part of a campaign to defeat the Ottomans and establish a French presence in the region. In search of allies, Napoleon issued a letter offering Palestine as a homeland to the Jews under French protection. He called on the Jews to rise up against what he called their oppressors. Napoleon's appeal was widely publicized, but he was ultimately defeated. In Acre today, the only memory of him is a statue atop a hill overlooking the city. Yet Napoleon's project for a Jewish homeland in the region under a colonial protectorate did not die. 40 years later, the plan was revived by the British, this time as a means of thwarting the rising power of Egyptian governor Muhammad Ali. In 1840, British Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston wrote to his ambassador in Constantinople, urging him to convince the Sultan and his entourage to open Palestine for the immigration of Jews. At that time, there were estimated to be no more than 3,000 Jews in Ottoman-controlled Palestine. Over the years, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased, helped on by wealthy benefactors. One of these was the French aristocrat Baron Edmond de Rothschild. He began visiting Palestine in the 1880s and became one of the Jewish community's leading sponsors. He spent over 14 million French francs to establish 30 Jewish settlements. The most important was Rishon LeZion, founded in 1882. Today, the remains of Baron de Rothschild lie in a mausoleum in northern Israel. It's a popular site for Israeli schoolchildren learning about the wealthy patron who bankrolled Jewish settlement building in Palestine over 100 years ago. In 1885, the term Zionism was first coined by Austrian writer Nathan Birnbaum. It's derived from the word Zion, one of the biblical names for Jerusalem. Zionism came to mean the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. But not all Jews supported this.
As explained by Dr. Hillel Cohen, an Israeli historian.
Of course, there was a Jewish community in the country under Ottoman rule, but they weren't Zionists, they were locals. The Jews who came from Europe, especially Eastern Europe, in the late 19th century, wanted to assert a new Jew.
In 1896, Theodor Herzl, an Austro-Hungarian journalist, wrote a book called The Jewish State. It is considered one of the most important texts of early Zionism. Herzl envisioned the founding of a future independent Jewish state during the 20th century. His colleague Max Nordau sent 2 rabbis to Palestine to investigate the prospects for a Jewish state there. Their report concluded, The bride is beautiful, but she is married to another man. The rabbis understood that Palestine's spouse was the Palestinian society rooted in its soil. In 1897, Herzl with Birnbaum and Nordau convened the first Zionist Congress in the Swiss city of Basel. The Congress adopted a program for the establishment of a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine.
Dr. Anis Sayer, the editor of the Palestinian Encyclopedia, explains how it happened.
Herzl openly lobbied for this. He contacted the major European powers to persuade them to protect such an entity. Herzl was the father of the Zionist state, but he didn't create the Zionist ideology. Herzl didn't hold a conference to bring these countries together. He exploited the competition between them. He told each one he'd secure their interests if they supported the establishment of a Jewish state at the expense of the others.
In 1907, the British government set up a committee to devise a strategy toward the Muslim Arab population of the Ottoman Empire. The committee's report, submitted to British Prime Minister Henry Campbell Bannerman in 1907, recommended establishing a so-called buffer state in Palestine. The report proposed this state be hostile to its neighbours and friendly to Europe. The aim was to divide the region and so assure Britain's continued imperial dominance.
Dr. Mohsen Saleh of Al Zaytuna Research Center explains how this objective was to be achieved.
Such a foreign body would be dependent on European colonialism. Its survival would be guaranteed in return for keeping surrounding states weak.
Israeli historian Dr. Hillel Cohen expands further.
The Europeans also believed the Jews to be closer to them than the Arabs. A Jewish state here would be better for them.
In 1907, Chaim Weizmann, a chemist who had emerged as a leader among British Zionists, visited Palestine for the first time. He set out to establish a company in Jaffa to develop the land of Palestine, a practical means to pursue the Zionist dream of building a Jewish state. His venture was supported by Baron de Rothschild. Within 3 years, a major deal was struck. The Jewish National Fund, set up to buy land in Palestine, purchased some 10,000 dunams in the Marj bin Amma region of northern Palestine. The sale to the Jewish National Fund had dire consequences for the thousands of Palestinian farmers living on the land.
Says Wakim, who heads an NGO for internally displaced Palestinians.
Over 60,000 Palestinians in the Marj bin Amma area were forced to leave. If the Nakba signifies the expulsion of the Palestinian citizen from his land and the seizure of his land, then the Nakba began decades before 1948.
British journalist David Hirst, a veteran Middle East correspondent who has written extensively on the region, says what happened then was worse than European colonialism.
A more drastic form of colonialism than the average classical European colonialism, in the sense that their purpose was actually not so much only to exploit the locals, but to drive them out.
The Israeli historian Dr. Ilan Pape says that Zionists believed they had to push the Palestinians out if they were serious about their planned statehood.
From the very early moment that the Zionist movement targeted Palestine as the place for Jewish independence and statehood, and it was clear that there were Palestinians on the land, the Zionist leaders and common people alike got used to the idea that the only way of making Palestine a Jewish state is by causing the Palestinians to leave.
Dr. Azmi Bishara, an Arab intellectual, highlights the objectives achieved.
Expelling the farmers accomplished two aims: seizing the land, or the Judaization of the land, and replacing Arab farmers with Jews from Eastern Europe and Yemen.
A Jewish militia known as Hashomer was established to protect the growing number of Jewish settlements.
That was in 1909. Then, 2 years later, in 1911,
Jews held demonstrations to demand the recognition of Hebrew as an official language under Ottoman rule.
Dr. Mahdi Abdul Hadi, head of the Palestinian Academic Society in Jerusalem, says the Arabs knew about the Zionist plans from the beginning.
The Arabs and Palestinians were aware of the concept of Zionism from day one. It's a racist movement seeking capital to colonize land and exploit religion to create a homeland for the remaining Jews of the world. It gives them an identity and a political future. This was clear in the writings of Najib Azuri and Najib Nasser.
In 1908, Najib Nasser, a Palestinian pharmacist, began publishing a newspaper called Al-Carmel. In it, he warned of Zionism as a movement aimed at displacing the Palestinians. He wrote, "The Jewish state would be a poisonous dagger in the heart of the Arabs." The outbreak of World War I in 1914 created new opportunities to reshape the Middle East.
Eugene Rogan, professor of modern Middle Eastern history at Oxford University, explains how Britain used the war to secure long-term interests in the region, relying on Zionist ambitions.
During the war, the British planned to secure the area of Palestine which lay close to the Suez Canal, especially as the British had a presence in Egypt. They favoured the Zionist organisation as a partner in a strategic colonial order.
In 1915, a secret memorandum was presented to the British cabinet under the title The Future of Palestine. It was drafted by Herbert Samuel, a British politician and Zionist committed to Palestine becoming a home for the Jewish people. In the document, Samuel advised that the time was not ripe for the establishment of an autonomous Jewish state in Palestine. He recommended instead that Palestine be annexed to the British Empire, describing this as the most welcome solution to the supporters of the Zionist movement. He expressed the hope that under British rule and over time, more Jews would settle in the land and grow into a majority among what he called the Mohammedans of Arab race. Samuel's recommendations were taken into account in the secret British-French agreement formulated by British politician Sir Mark Sykes and French diplomat François-Georges Picot. The Sykes-Picot agreement opened the way for the establishment of a Jewish state. In 1917, the British cabinet, headed by Prime Minister David Lloyd George, pledged to establish a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. The pledge came in the form of a letter from the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to the influential British Zionist Lord Walter Rothschild.
The Balfour Pledge was the official position of Britain, supporting a homeland for the Jews in Palestine. Professor Eugene Rogan once again explains.
Balfour
represented the British government. When he wrote his letter to Lord Rothschild, it was on behalf of the British government. Rothschild played the role of lobbyist to encourage the British government to take a stance regarding the Jews in Palestine. Behind all this stood Chaim Weizmann, who took part in the writing of the pledge, heading the World Zionist Organization.